Welcome to Democracy Winners, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Kate Laddish, and I'm a member of DW's steering committee, and I'm today's facilitator. And before I introduce our speaker, I'll give a quick overview of our group. Founded 6 years ago, pretty much to the hour, in Winters, California, Democracy Winners is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to strengthening democracy, protecting constitutional freedoms, and promoting informed engagement in local, state, and national politics. Our weekly newsletter includes previews of meetings such as this morning, as well as a call of the week, opportunities for civic engagement, and more. We have members from throughout the region, and if you'd like to join our newsletter list, you can, of course, most of you can send me a Zoom chat with your email address, or anybody can email us at info@democracywinters.org. And the first hour of our meetings features guest speakers, and after that we have 30 minutes to hear from our federal, state, and local issues trackers before wrapping up at noon. And now it is very much my pleasure to introduce journalist Heath Druzin, who will speak with us about extremism in America. And Heath has been reporting for 20 years for both newspaper and public radio. Most recently, he was the host and creator of the Extremely American podcast, an inside look at how militias and other far-right groups are trying to remake American politics in their absolutist image. He's a former fellow for Guns in America, a collaborative of 10 NPR affiliates examining the role of guns in American life. And for that project, Heath was based at Boise State Public Radio and spent 2 years reporting on guns with a focus on extremism and gun suicide. Now he's a freelance reporter and podcaster covering extremism, politics, and the environment for outlets such as NPR, BBC, The Daily Beast, and Postindustrial magazine. And he's the spring 2023 visiting Pollner Professor at the University of Montana School of Journalism. In his time covering extremism, Heath has talked to some of the most prominent militia movement members in the country, attended weapons training, militia rallies, and interviewed the local leaders and activists pushing back against far-right movements. Previously, he spent more than 6 years on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan covering the wars there for Stars and Stripes newspaper. Before that, he worked for newspapers in California, Louisiana, and Idaho, and he was a Carter Center Mental Health Journalism Fellow. Although he's now based in the Northern Rockies, Heath is no stranger to our area and is a 2003 graduate of UC Davis. And so Heath will give a 40-minute presentation followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. And I'd like to thank Martin Coos for connecting us with Heath. And Heath, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that, that introduction, very thorough introduction. I was going to do a little about me, but I think you got it covered. But yeah, it's great to talk to you guys. And yeah, I'm a proud Aggie. So before all of this, I was a writer and an editor at the Aggie, back when it was a daily broadsheet. So I'm dating myself a little bit there. And I guess doing the math, it's my 20th college reunion, if those are a thing. But yeah, so thanks for having me. It's great to be in Winters virtually. I've actually been there in person quite a few times. And I think this is unfortunately it's a topic that I kind of thought I would pick up and cover for a little bit, but it keeps getting more and more and more relevant in the US. So it's something that's sort of become my career for now. But to talk a little bit about about what I cover, I really look at the intersection of extremism and politics, and I think it's important to talk a little bit about what I cover and how I kind of decide whether to cover it, because that's a question I get a lot and an important one. I get a lot of questions about, well, why are you giving this guy press? Why are you platforming this or this group? And I think it's a great question. And sorry if I'm cutting off somebody's question down the road, but I think one of the hardest parts of this job right now is to decide when not to cover something. And I think it's a really important call to make, because there are groups out there who, who might not otherwise get much attention, who don't matter. And that's the big question I ask myself right now is, does this group matter? Why do they matter? And what's their potential for action? And by action, I could mean, mass protests. I could mean actual violence. It depends. So I like to use an example of a neighbor of mine who lives about 45 minutes away. 45 minutes from Boise, I should say. Ammon Bundy. You guys probably have heard the name, but Ammon Bundy is part of the Bundy family that's been involved in 2 armed standoffs with the federal government in Nevada and then in Oregon. He subsequently moved from Nevada to Idaho and has been very, very loud ever since there, including a run for governor in which he just got 20% of the vote, which is the most a third-party candidate has ever got in Idaho. Far from winning, but definitely a pretty meaningful campaign and a lot of protest votes. So Ammon Bundy, I bring him up partly because you guys probably know who he is, and partly because he's somebody I struggle with. I have done a lot of coverage of him because I do think he matters. He runs an anti-government network with upwards of 50,000 people across the country called People's Rights. So Ammon Bundy definitely is somebody who I think if we don't pay attention to, that's at our own peril. However, he does a lot of stunts. He'll show up at the courthouse and shake his fists and say that the court system and the hospitals are kidnapping children, stuff like this. So there's been a lot of times when Ammon does stuff like that where I ignore it because I'm like, you know what, I think he's just trying to raise money. He's just trying to gin up attention, and he's not really doing anything. Whereas there was an event that I struggled with early on in the pandemic, which I did show up to, where it was I believe it was April of 2020. So it was really right at the beginning of everybody starting to react to the pandemic. And he had this organization, he had this meeting in his warehouse in Emmett, Idaho, where he was gathering people to basically plan a resistance. And I struggled with that, right? I was like, I don't know, but is this real? Is this just bluster? But my thinking was, you know what, he's certainly showed the ability to rally people in the past. Why don't I show up, check it out? Well, that ended up being the beginning of a years-long, ongoing protest movement that became People's Rights, this now national anti-government network. So I'm rambling a little bit, but these are sort of I kind of think it's maybe interesting sometimes to hear the thinking of journalists and how they decide what to cover and what not to cover, because especially on my beat, a lot of times it's a blank slate. I'm not a daily reporter. I'm not going out and just covering the protest of the day. I really have to decide what's worth my time and what's not worth my time, especially when I'm going deeper into a story. That ended up being the right call. His group didn't grow because I was there. I promise you that. I'd love to give myself that kind of power, but his group did grow. And that meeting, being at that first meeting, was important to kind of see the roots of this growing movement that really just snowballed with the pandemic. Because they were able to unite forces from the anti-vax movement, the militia movement, just sort of everyday folks who always kind of had far-right views but never had an outlet. So it was a really important moment to see, because it grew from, I think there were 45 people at that meeting and then to tens of thousands. So that's a question I get asked a lot. How do you decide what to cover? How do you decide what not to cover? I'm talking to my students about that right now. And the fact is, it's a hard call. It's subjective, but you ask yourself, do they matter? Why do they matter? And what is their potential for action? The other question I get a lot, and it's a very fair question, is why do you always cover the far right? Where's your podcast on Antifa? And it's, I think you need to be able to answer that question. The short answer right now is that there's extremism on the right and on the left. There's no question about that. There's political violence on both sides, but the far right just matters more right now. The far right matters more. They're bigger. There's been more violence on the far right and more meaningful violence, because the far right has people in power. Antifa doesn't have a Marjorie Taylor Greene. Antifa is a sort of small, leaderless movement that is important in certain places. Certainly, if you're in Portland or Seattle, I think you might have a different view of Antifa's importance than out here in Missoula. Like Missoula and Boise, these are the places where the far right always likes to say there's this Antifa bus or Antifa plane coming, but it never shows up. It's more of a rumor than a fact. But yeah, if you're in Portland and they're brawling in the streets and burning down buildings from time to time, it's a little bit of a different story, but it's hyper localized, and they don't have political support and they don't have political organization. You can say the squad in Congress, these kind of far left members, you can say they're radical or whatever. And there's an argument to be made there, but what they aren't is connected to far left movements that cause violence. I'm sure you get some arguments from some people on that, but it's just not that organized. Whereas the far right, they have been, if you get a chance to listen to my podcast, shameless promotion, anywhere you get podcasts, but if you listen to that, you start to get a sense for why they matter, because they're taking over school boards. They are either taking over or putting major pressure on library boards, which I think a lot of people don't even know are elected in a lot of places. In Idaho, they're even they're in the process of potentially sinking an important community college in North Idaho, because they've taken over the board, they've pushed out the president, and now that school is on the verge of losing its accreditation because of what they've done. These are things that fly under the radar. I think a lot of people aren't familiar maybe with who's on their school board, certainly not who's on their community college board. So this is why my focus has been so largely on the far right, because they matter more, they're more effective right now. I frankly don't want to waste my time doing a deep dive on a movement that doesn't matter. Mainly because who cares, but also because, that gets back to that, do I want to platform somebody who otherwise wouldn't have as big a platform? So yeah, the far right's been effective. Their ideas right now, I think we're seeing on the national level, they're really becoming mainstreamed. You guys have seen this grooming panic that's been going around, and this that dovetails with all of these protests at drag events. I mean, the thing that sort of hasn't been reported as much as time has gone on about that people need to be reminded of, is all of that came straight out of QAnon. This is sort of the mainstream version of the idea that there's this cabal of child predators who are feeding on adrenochrome from children. I mean, it's literally that crazy. It's sort of morphed into this grooming conspiracy as a way to kind of keep it up, but in a more palatable, as unpalatable as it might seem, with a more palatable story. So I think it's important to see where these ideas are coming from and how they're getting mainstreamed, because this whole kind of homophobic grooming panic, which is not going away, it's straight out of QAnon, which, I think a lot of us laughed off at the beginning. I'm guilty. I always kept an eye on it, but I was a little surprised at how much it hung on and sort of became a political force. And yeah, I mean, that's just the power of these ideas that a few years ago, I think would have just been laughed out of the room, in mainstream GOP circles. Even politicians who certainly don't believe in any of this and probably are uncomfortable with it, I think they're now in the position where they feel like they either have to embrace or ignore it because they have political cachet. And in Republican circles, what that means is, if I take a hard stand against this grooming conspiracy, I might lose my primary. We've certainly seen that. We saw these midterms. It was kind of a wipeout for far-right candidates in the general election because they have a real low ceiling on their popularity in a general electorate. But what we also saw before that was these far-right candidates were winning their primaries. So that's why it matters, because these ideas in a primary where you have a much more far-right electorate than you do in the general election, they work. Not always, not everywhere. It depends. But there's plenty of places where, one of the things I covered in my podcast was this election in Ohio. It's a district with a congresswoman named Marcy Kaptur, who's the longest serving congresswoman in history. And it's been gerrymandered. Now it's sort of an R+4+5 district. But it's never been a super far left district. But I took a look at that because there was this QAnon candidate who in any other year really wouldn't have had a shot, especially because he was facing very mainstream Republican opposition with name recognition, but he won. He won the primary. He ended up getting beaten pretty badly in the general election, partly because he fabricated part of his military record. But he was the Republican candidate. He had Trump's endorsement. He had the state GOP's endorsement. Those things matter, right? I mean, that legitimizes these ideas. This is a guy who was in DC on January 6th, says he never crossed the police lines, and there isn't evidence that he did, but he also isn't too bothered by people crossing the police lines. He wants to overturn the election, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, these ideas matter because they're these ideas are getting elected. It was interesting to see the midterms though, because I think we saw perhaps the ceiling of popularity on these ideas, which is a conundrum for far-right agitators. You saw Carrie Lake lose in Arizona in an election where it was close, and I think a normal Republican probably would have won that election. In Nevada, you had a fairly far-right guy knock out the governor there, but he definitely wasn't as not as bombastic as a Carrie Lake. So it'll be interesting to see where the Republican Party goes from here, because pragmatically, you'd think that they want to cast out these ideas that are poison in a competitive general election, but they also have to get through their own primaries. So I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm not as familiar with California's GOP, but what we've seen in Idaho is that the mainstream Republicans are still winning statewide office for the most part, but the far-right Republicans have absolutely taken over the GOP structure because they're smart. They know that their popularity in a general election and even sometimes in primaries is limited. But when you are running for GOP positions, like when you're running for GOP treasurer, chair, or whatever, when you're running in precincts, those aren't general elections. Those are just like hardcore party faithful, and they've been able to pick off those positions, and now they're sort of running the party here in full rebellion against their own governor, who's certainly a very conservative guy, although they like to call him a socialist. This guy would be like far right in California, certainly. But I bring that up because it's interesting. There's some real pragmatism there at work where they know that it's going to be hard to take over the party through popular votes, but it's not as hard to take over the party just by being the officers running in those elections. So we'll see where it goes. You've got the governor versus the GOP chairwoman right now in Idaho. How that shakes out, I don't know. The governor beat back a far right challenger very easily this past election, but the GOP takeover of the party hadn't been complete yet. He had a very friendly chairman who got knocked out after the election. So those are things that also fly under the radar that I think are important to pay attention to. Who's running the party apparatus? Who's trying to run the party apparatus? Is there a civil war going on in your local and state party? Because we're seeing that a lot with the GOP. These far right folks, they want to kind of purify the GOP, and I would argue that some of them see mainstream Republicans as even worse than Democrats because they see them as turncoats. They see them as betraying the true, constitutional principles that the party should be based on. Now, obviously, the Constitution, that is their reading only, and any other reading is unacceptable to them. Not a lot of room for compromise there. But yeah, I think the future of the Republican Party is very much in flux right now. And I think these midterm elections hurt the far right a lot. But if you don't think you can get through your primary without embracing these ideas or not opposing them, breaking news here, most politicians are not so noble that they'll willingly lose an election or hurt their chances for winning by doing the right thing and saying this conspiracy theory is BS, or there is in fact not a cabal of Democrats feasting on children. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Politicians want to win. There's very few politicians in America who are willing to lose for a cause. What we saw with the Trump impeachment was that it is a losing proposition to oppose him in a primary. At least it was. I think that's changing. But I think, check me on my exact numbers here, but I think every Republican save one who voted for Trump's impeachment either retired or lost their primary. I think one actually won a close race. So that's the thing. You can't be in politics if you can't win your primary. And that's what a lot of these folks are running into. So that's sort of my state of the far right. I want to quickly, before we get to questions, I don't know if everyone can see it, hopefully, but I posted this little worksheet that I use, and it's not comprehensive. I constantly update it, but it's looking at different strains of American extremism. And I think this is really important because a lot of people get it wrong. There's a need in American journalism and also in politics to really simplify everything. And I think in extremism, that's really dangerous because you lose the nuance. So a lot of people want to put every far right group, every militia group under this broad banner of white nationalist. It's not true. Does that mean that a lot of these groups don't have offensive ideologies? A lot of these groups don't say things that some of you might consider white nationalist, or certainly from a viewpoint that that promotes a worldview that is not conducive to a multicultural society? Yeah, totally. But I think it's really dangerous to be like, that militia, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, they're the same as the KKK. because they're not. They're different. They have different goals. They have different strategies for sure. And when we conflate all of them together, we lose some important understanding, ways of understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it. And I think that is one reason that the federal government has struggled so much, I think, to respond to threats of domestic terrorism, to respond to far-right anti-government groups, to be totally blindsided by January 6th. Part of that's just a lack of understanding of these groups. Part of it's also obviously a focus since 9/11 on foreign terrorism, to the detriment of any kind of focus on domestic terrorism. But just to go through a few, pull up my own worksheet here. There's an expert who I really like to talk to. She till recently was a professor at Vanderbilt, and one of the few kind of ivory tower types who has been on the ground with militia groups and not just sort of studying them from afar. Her name's Amy Cooter, and she has a really good term she's coined called, the umbrella for these groups is nostalgic groups. And she could explain it better than me, but essentially the short version is what binds these groups together is a nostalgic view for a past that really probably never existed as they see it. But, they see this kind of 1950s past, this idealized America where there was patriotism was unquestioned, and, everybody had, traditional family values, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's it's a helpful term, because I think it shows you kind of the goal and the discomfort with things like trans rights. Why does that resonate so much with all these groups, even though they disagree on a million things? And it's important to know that they disagree on a million things. Because a lot of these militias, they will say that they're anti-racist, and certainly I think a lot of these leaders, I don't think they are racist. Now they might have some views that that a lot of people would argue with and say, well, like, you might say you're not racist, but this kind of view hurts marginalized people. But there's a lot of widely varying views among these groups. But one thing that they've really all kind of united on is this anti-trans activism. And I think that gets to their nostalgic view of the world. They want a past where a man was a man and a woman was a woman, and it makes them uncomfortable when those social norms are challenged. They feel like their whole sort of reality is being challenged. And I think that's why you see a lot of these groups getting so worked up about that particular issue. So, some of the main strains of extremism, you've got anti-government militias, which a lot of these militias now, they're so press savvy that they don't want to be called militias. But when I say a militia, I mean a group of people who are doing weapons training together for the possible eventuality of armed conflict with the government. We could probably have a long conversation about what a militia is, but I think that's what people think of when they hear the term, and that's what I use. These groups, a big part of it is training for a potential conflict with the government. What's interesting is they have become much more press savvy. A lot of them are very publicly, they'll say they're anti-racist. They'll say they're not, conspiracy theorists, although we've seen that break down with the pandemic quite a bit. And a lot of them are either running for office or lobbying at state capitals to great effect. So it's not your 1990s militia with guys hiding out in the woods, saying, pox on all politics. These guys are politically active, and unlike in the 90s, they've sort of taken a side and been much more comfortable being part of the Republican Party, which is different. Another big set of groups. And militias, I mean, some of the main ones, 3%ers, Oath Keepers, those are the main national militia movements, but you'll see a lot of different localized groups. You won't be surprised to hear that anti-government groups aren't very good at centralized command. So you get a lot of splinter groups, and some of them hate each other. I mean, absolutely hate each other. Yeah, I mean, I had a 3% leader in Washington, a prominent guy, called his cohort in Georgia a racist asshole on tape. So, and that's interesting. That's kind of what I'm getting at. The guy in Washington didn't like that the guy in Georgia was using a Confederate flag as part of his logo. So yes, so these guys are all over the map, but they all do weapons training. Then you've got culture warriors, I call them. And these guys sometimes get misidentified as militias, but they don't really do the training to fight the government. I'm talking about groups like the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, which is more of a kind of almost like a local Proud Boys in the Northwest. The John Birch Society, which is still a thing, or I should say is a thing again. They sort of disappeared for a long time, but they've actually become a political force in some places, especially in the Northwest. So yeah, unlike militia groups, these guys don't really do weapons training, at least not in an organized way. They like guns, don't get me wrong, but the Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, they're much more street brawlers. They really, really like to go fight Antifa or just left-wing protesters in Portland, Vancouver, Washington, Seattle. But they are much more focused on cultural issues. They really like to show up at school board meetings and yell at people for being friendly to LGBTQ rights. So yeah, just they will sometimes link up with militia groups. There's certainly some friendly relations and sometimes very unfriendly relations, but I think it's important to know that it's a very separate movement. Even though some of the members might be members of both, the movements themselves, the goal of the Proud Boys, it is also to take America back to their sort of idealized version, but it's also just to get in the streets and fight and mess up left-wing protesters. Then you've got anti-vaccine groups, which were really under the radar until the pandemic, and that group. That strain of American extremism took off more than any other, I'd say, with the pandemic. They were, I don't think a lot of people thought of these groups much at all before the pandemic. Now they've really joined forces with a lot of militia groups, especially, and like the John Birch Society in the Northwest. They've organized rallies, and I think they've really effectively convinced quite a few people that vaccines are dangerous. And I will say they're mostly a phenomenon of the far right, but you'll get the real kind of crunchy left dovetailing with them, and perhaps not jumping on all their political views, but they'll join forces to be, to kind of hold these rallies against vaccines and spread some disinformation. So yeah, anti-vaccine groups, that is the strain that I've seen more than any really take off. And then you've got your just straight up white supremacist and racist accelerant groups. Patriot Front's one that's made some noise, Identity Europa / American Identity Movement, White Lives Matter, and then like the really, really violent ones like Adam Waffen and the Base or neo-Nazi groups. These groups, it's important to separate them out because they don't really have political goals other than they want to create chaos, they want to spark a race war, and they want to fill the vacuum. They have this sort of apocalyptic vision where they know they're not popular, but they think if they can, shut down the power grid and create anarchy or create race riots, that they could fill the vacuum and create some kind of ethno-state. So very different goals than the other groups I mentioned, who very much want political power, or their ideas at least to have political power. I'm going to open it up to questions in a second because I don't want to ramble too much. But there certainly are left-wing. There are left-wing groups. They don't matter as much, but they're out there. There's a left-wing militia movement called the John Brown Gun Club. They're pretty prominent. They show up at a lot of protests as sort of a counter to these armed protesters who will show up. So these are armed left-wing protesters. You've got some Black nationalist militias. One's called the Rise of the Moors. They've made some news around the country because they've had a few tense armed standoffs with cops. They have sort of a novel view that that goes back to Moroccan kingdom, that basically that they should run Texas. There's a whole complicated view. It's kind of interesting, but anyway, they show up once in a while. There's one called the Not Fucking Around Coalition, which is a Black nationalist militia. I'm sorry, they won a Black ethno-state in Texas. I mixed them up. But they will show up armed once in a while. They've had a few accidental discharges that injured a few people. So you might have heard of them. And then we talked about, obviously, Antifa, which is certainly a movement that matters here, but just not as much as a lot of the far-right groups. So with that, let me open it up to questions.
Great. Heath, thanks a bunch. And let's see, and Jen, you're first in line for questions.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So my question is that it just felt like there's a core thread through a lot of these movements is really a base level of misogyny. You saw it when kind of some of these, and you get into Bannon and stuff who started this off with, there's a lot of suggestions that some of the more modern movements started with Gamergate. And so it just didn't feel like some of that, and they do a lot of recruiting on the gaming websites and the like, for, to radicalize young men into the anti-feminist rights and things like that. And so I just didn't hear you talk about that.
I only had 40 minutes. So yes, there's plenty I didn't talk about. You're absolutely right, though. There is a fairly big corner of the far right that kind of came out of Gamergate. The Groypers are a big part of that. Nick Fuentes is a white nationalist who's gained a frighteningly big platform that's all kind of come from that. Misogyny absolutely is a huge underlying part of that movement. So yeah, no, we have seen that. So-called traditional gender roles are a big part of a lot of the far right, and a lot of that means a limited role for women. So yeah, sexism, misogyny, I mean, that is certainly a part of a lot of these movements. And if you want to talk about Gamergate and Groypers, it's a huge part of it, and it even dovetails into some of the really scary incel stuff, which has led to some really horrific violence.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Brian, you're up next.
Thanks, Kate. And Heath, thanks for such a thorough presentation. Really appreciate you coming on. I don't know if this is something you cover or not, or if you've covered or not, but there's a fair amount of these members that are ex-military. And the short time I was in the service, the main questions we got were about communist affiliations, which tells you how long ago that was. But I'm wondering if you've covered or know of other people who covered efforts within the U.S. military to try to ferret some of this out.
Yeah, and I used to work in Iraq and Afghanistan for Stars and Stripes, so I did a lot of coverage of the military. Yeah, so it's a big problem. I'd say anecdotally, at least, it's a growing problem. You just had 3 active duty Marines arrested for their role in January 6th, which is obviously alarming for a lot of reasons. For a long time, you've had white supremacist groups try to get their members into the military to basically get free weapons training, and all the better if they get to go to war. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, that's straight out of it's straight out of a kind of ISIS kind of playbook too. they have more in common than a lot of people think. So yeah, it's a problem in the military, and it's a problem the military hasn't been very good at addressing. And I think part of that's probably because you have elements in the military who maybe just don't want to address it. And part of it's because it's a big, clunky, bureaucratic machine that is pretty bad at responding to things very quickly. Yeah. But yeah, it's terrifying, right? I mean, look, if you've got, especially if you've got these accelerationist white supremacist group, I'm using a jargon term, but if you got white supremacist groups who want to cause violence, and they are getting expert training on weapons and access to weapons that maybe they might steal, especially with National Guard units, I think they're a little more vulnerable. I think it's a huge concern. Some of these groups want to go out there and kill a lot of people. And it's something the military needs to catch up on. And unfortunately, I don't see that problem going away anytime soon. I'm a little worried that that's going to increase.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Ken.
Great, thanks for coming and sharing your viewpoint. It's really the breadth of it is great. I'm a conservationist, and I like the fact that you're centered up in the Idaho, Montana area, and I'm glad you brought up the Bundys, because it seems like one of the anchor points to that particular corner is this the distrust of the federal government has a lot to do with land rights. And what I'm interested in is, I've read a lot about that. I think we all probably know it pretty well. Bundys have popularized, or at least made it covered a lot in the media. What I'm interested in is what the traction is of that particular viewpoint, like especially with the ascendancy of these right-wing groups in the Mountain West. Are they getting a lot of traction with, let's say, conservative, standard, old-time Western people? Or is it the influx of militia types and survivalists and all that who have been coming to the same area that is sort of leading the sort of popularization and the power of that viewpoint? Are they getting pushback from traditional residents in that area or anywhere else in the West that you know of?
Yes. Yes to all of that. No, so it's more the second, I would say, more that these types of folks are moving into areas like North Idaho and pumping up their numbers. I will say, is Ammon Bundy's idea, are they getting traction? They're getting enough traction that he can build up this group of angry people that does stuff like shuts down an entire hospital in downtown Boise for a while. But they are not popular. And that is something I think, especially when the national press parachutes in, it's like, ooh, Ammon Bundy, people like Ammon Bundy, he's running for governor, maybe he's going to win. He was never going to win. It's something that he got 20% of the vote. I will say that, but he's not popular. A lot of people hate him. A lot of conservatives really hate him. There's a whole episode in my podcast where I'm talking to this really prominent rancher in Eastern Idaho who is very conservative. She's been involved in Republican politics for decades. She was the head of the Cattle Association in Idaho, which is an important position there. She absolutely fucking hates these guys. And a lot of people like that do. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's important to get those views. It's a little boring to be like, oh, this liberal hates Ammon Bundy. Well, of course. Or this liberal, doesn't like what the far right's doing. Well, sure. And it's not to say that those voices don't have a place in this reporting, but I think it's much more interesting to see how many conservatives do not like these folks and are speaking out against them. So I brought her up also to say a lot of ranchers really don't like the Bundys because you know what ranchers do and have to do? Pay their grazing fees, work with the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management because they're grazing on their land. And do they always like what the Forest Service and BLM does? No. Do they usually have a working, professional, respectful relationship? Yes. So sometimes the support gets overblown. And it's important to realize, yeah, a lot of conservative ranchers, you know, not everyone might agree with them on environmental issues or their use of the land, but there is, I would say broadly, an idea that we have to work together, and that people like the Bundys are freeloading at you know, honest ranchers' expenses.
Good news. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And Martin, you're up next.
Hey, Heath, can you hear me? Hey, brother, good to see you. I like that bright light shining behind you as if you're a celestial presence in our midst. I was curious about your approach to reporting on these groups, given that on the one hand, they're more media savvy, but they're also more media skeptical. You've done a great job of finding that balance between reporting candidly on them and yet gaining their trust. They seem to allow you to kind of come inside that velvet rope. And I'd just be curious to hear you describe how you've navigated that, because you do it so well. And this is the sort of thing where you actually need access. You need to be able to talk with these folks. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your process.
Yes. And hey, Martin, it's good to talk to you, man. So yeah, it's a tricky balance, right? And I will say it ebbs and flows. These guys are very moody. Some of them will talk to me sometimes, and some of them will be angry with me over something I wrote, and they won't talk to me at other times. The way I approach them, though, is first I try to do my research really thoroughly and speak their language. So, you know, at least they know that I'm not I don't know, conflating a AR-15 with a machine gun, things like that. I make sure that I can speak their language. I make sure that I kind of know the history of the movement, so I can at least show them that, like, I'm not gonna make clumsy mistakes. And then I'm pretty honest with them. I'm like, hey, you might not love everything in what I'm gonna write. Your opponents won't love everything in what I write, but you know, I'm here to talk to you because I want to give you at least a fair shake. And I'm giving you a chance to have your voice heard and push back on criticisms. So I just try to approach them honestly, but I think it does help. It certainly helps to be based in Idaho, or at the moment in Montana. It helps to not be like, hey, I'm Heath from Brooklyn. And it helps to speak their language a lot. I think as soon as you show it, even if they don't fully trust you, because I don't know if they ever fully trust me, at least I give them the confidence that I know their world and I know their issues, even if they probably think I don't, you know, agree with them. And yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not joining a militia, you know, going to fight the government. So I don't think that's a secret, but I just try to be upfront with them about, you might not like all of this, but I'm here to get your voice in there.
Wow, that's a really, really fascinating answer. When might season 2 of Extremely American be rolling out? Excellent.
There are talks going on right now. We will see. I hope by the end of the year you'll have something to listen to. But yes,
Great.
there's plans in the works. we're trying to work out how to pay for it, but to be frank, but yes, that's the plan. I'm hoping by the end of the year we have something to listen to.
Great. Thanks, man. Great to see you.
You too, Martin.
Thanks. Great question. And Jill.
This is maybe a little bit too broad. It's more from an existential sort of perspective. Where do you see all of this going? You know, I mean, it feels like things are so, like we're in such a dangerous place right now, and you know, this things could go, you know, in a multitude of directions. What do you foresee?
I think this country's kind of living election to election right now. Yeah, I think the thing that worries me is the erosion of a common understanding of democratic norms and the importance of fair representation. I think you've seen on the far right that that's broken down, and that and I don't say this as necessarily a pejorative, but there's an anti-democratic streak. Now, it's not even a value judgment. It's just a fact. A lot of people I talk to on the far right will say, I hate democracy. We are not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. And I mean, of course, there's sort of a kernel of truth there, that, you know, we have the Electoral College, for better or for worse, and it's not the most democratic system, but it also ignores the fact that this country has a lot of democracy, a lot of one person, one vote, and it's very important to it. And I think you'd see a lot of people on the far right get rid of a lot of that. I mean, we didn't always directly elect senators, and we're relitigating things that I never thought we'd relitigate. You know, we're relitigating the Civil War. I mean, I'm not relitigating the Civil War, but like, you know, you've got all these things coming up where you're like, isn't that settled? So that concerns me. I mean, what's interesting is I feel like something has to come to a head, because these ideas are not popular. I think that's an important thing that I keep bringing up. They're not popular. And I think some of the more savvy folks on the far right realize that, and that's part of the reason that they are pushing back on so many democratic norms, because they know that when push comes to shove, most people don't like what they're saying. So they're trying to find workarounds, like taking over GOPs and taking over local elections with low turnouts that people don't pay attention to. But I will say, I think the vast majority of Americans, conservative, liberal, moderate, I think do support democratic norms. And I think that's, you know, I think that eventually wins the day, but we're in for turbulent times for a while. I mean, if the midterms had gone a different way, I don't know. If the midterms had gone a different way, I think we'd be having a different conversation. As it is, we've got some chaos going on in DC right now, more than usual. So yeah, I don't see these ideas gaining more popularity. The question is, are they going to be able to find enough workarounds working around the democratic process to gain more power? And I think that's going to have a lot to do with how elections go in the near future.
Thanks.
That's great.
Sunshine and kittens on my beat here.
Woohoo!
Sunshine and kittens. That's great. So, yeah, well, you know, I think that was probably a great question to wrap up on. I feel like I have all sorts of different things bubbling up that I still want to ask you about, but this has been fantastic. Really appreciate it, Heath. And thank you so much for joining us right after your first week at a new teaching gig. So,
Right.
so extra big thanks for that.
Thank you. You gave me some good fodder for my students. I'm sorry to jump off, but I've got a 1-year-old bouncing off the walls, and my poor wife is
Go, man, go. Go, man, go. Don't keep the
Thank
white
you.
ladies waiting.
Take care.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, Heath.